I'm Clara Whitfield, 78, and I was supposed to be a widow who never existed when the Titanic sank in 1912. I lost my husband Thomas in those icy waters, but his mother refused to believe we were ever married. A factory girl like you could never be my son's wife, she spat, denying me any claim to his name or memory. She had money, influence, and the power to erase me from his life entirely. But when the official survivor list arrived, 3 weeks later, it carried more than just names. It carried the truth that would shatter her world and reveal a secret that would change everything about the Sullivan family legacy forever. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever fought to prove your worth against those who tried to erase you, like this video. Let me take you back to where it all began in April 1911. When I was just 23 and working the looms at Sullivan Textile Mill in Boston. The factory floors were loud, dusty places where girls like me spent 12-hour days for barely enough wages to keep a roof over our heads. I shared a cramped boarding house room with 3 other factory girls, and we considered ourselves lucky to have steady work. Thomas Sullivan wasn't supposed to notice me. He was the owner's son, 26 years old, educated at Harvard, and destined to inherit the family business. But he spent his days walking the factory floors, learning every aspect of the operation from his father. While other wealthy young men played tennis at country clubs, Thomas rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside the foreman. I'll never forget the day he stopped at my loom. A thread had snapped, and I was struggling to retie it when his shadow fell across my workstation. "Here, let me help," he said, his voice gentle above the machine noise. His hands were soft but skilled as he fixed the thread with practiced ease. "You're Clara, aren't you? You've been here almost 2 years." That he knew my name surprised me. That he knew how long I'd worked there shocked me completely. "Yes, sir," I managed, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "Thank you for the help." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, and something shifted in my chest. "Call me Thomas, and you're welcome." Over the following weeks, he found reasons to check on my section more frequently. A question about production quotas here, a concern about ventilation there. Each time, our conversations lasted a little longer. He asked about my family. My parents had died when I was 19, leaving me entirely alone in the world. He told me about his studies, his dreams of improving working conditions, his frustration with his father's old-fashioned methods. The other girls noticed, of course. They whispered warnings about rich men who toyed with factory girls for amusement. But Thomas wasn't like that. When he looked at me, I saw something deeper than casual interest. I saw longing, the same ache I felt every time he walked away. By autumn, we were meeting in secret, Sunday afternoons in the park, evening walks along the harbor. When the factory was closed, he brought me books, poetry, novels. Listened intently as I shared my thoughts. I'd never met anyone who valued my opinions the way Thomas did. "I'm going to marry you," he said one October evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the water. The words came out sudden and sure, as if he'd been holding them back for weeks. My heart stopped. "Thomas, your family, my family, will have to accept it." "I don't care about their approval, Clara. I care about you." But I knew his mother, Margaret Sullivan. I'd seen her visit the factory twice, sweeping through in her expensive dresses, and looking at us workers like we were slightly unpleasant insects. She had plans for her son, plans that certainly didn't include a penniless Irish factory girl. "They'll never accept me," I whispered. "Then we'll make our own way." He took my hands in his. "I have some money set aside, and I've been offered a position managing a textile operation in New York. We could start fresh there, away from all this." That's when he told me about the marriage certificate hidden in the records at St. Patrick's Church. Father O'Brien had agreed to marry us in secret, with only 2 witnesses, the church janitor and his wife. The ceremony was simple, private, but completely legal. Thomas had thought of everything. "I wanted to be your husband officially before I asked you to leave everything behind," he explained. "This way, no matter what happens, you're protected. You're Mrs. Thomas Sullivan, even if the world doesn't know it yet." I stared at the simple gold band he slipped onto my finger. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. We were married. In the eyes of God and the law, I was his wife. The months following our secret marriage were both the happiest and most terrifying of my life. Thomas and I lived as husband and wife in private while maintaining the charade of employer and employee at the factory. He rented a small apartment across town where we could be together without suspicion, and I kept my room at the boarding house as cover. Thomas threw himself into planning our escape to New York with the enthusiasm of a man who'd finally found his purpose. He'd been offered a position managing a modern textile facility in Manhattan, better pay, better conditions, and most importantly, far from his family's influence. "We'll start completely fresh," he promised during one of our stolen evenings together. "No one will know about my family's money or your humble beginnings. We'll just be Thomas and Clara Sullivan, building a life together." But first, he had to secure his inheritance. His grandfather's will had established a trust that would come to Thomas upon his marriage. But the money was tied up in family lawyers and bureaucracy. His mother controlled access to the funds until Thomas reached 30 or married with family approval. Thomas had been working quietly with a lawyer in New York to access the inheritance regardless of his family's blessing. "The law is on our side," he explained one evening, as we planned our departure. "Grandfather's will doesn't specify that the family must approve of my bride, only that I must be married. Our certificate from St. Patrick's is all the proof we need." I worried constantly about discovery. Margaret Sullivan had a way of appearing at the factory unexpectedly, and I lived in terror that she might notice something different about her son's behavior. Thomas had become lighter, more confident, and anyone who knew him well might wonder why. The breakthrough came in March 1912. Thomas's New York lawyer confirmed that the inheritance claim was solid, and the position at the Manhattan textile facility was officially offered. Thomas accepted immediately, giving his father 2 weeks' notice that sent shockwaves through the Sullivan family. "They think I'm having some kind of breakdown," Thomas told me, laughing despite the seriousness of the situation. "Father keeps asking if I need to see a doctor. Mother is convinced I've fallen under the influence of unsavory elements in the city." That's when Thomas surprised me with the tickets to first-class passages aboard the RMS Titanic, departing Southampton on April 10th. He'd booked our passage under the name Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Sullivan. Our first public acknowledgement as a married couple. First class. I stared at the elegant tickets in disbelief. "Thomas, the expense, we can afford it now," he said, pulling me into his arms. "Besides, I want our honeymoon voyage to be perfect. We'll dine in the finest restaurants, dance in the grand ballroom, and arrive in New York as the married couple we truly are." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Thomas would tell his family he was sailing to New York alone to finalize his business arrangements. Meanwhile, I would quietly leave Boston and meet him in Southampton. To the world, we would be a proper married couple beginning our new life together. I gave my notice at the factory, telling my roommates I'd found work in New York. Thomas arranged for our belongings to be shipped separately, and we spent our last weeks in Boston saying goodbye to the only life we'd ever known. The night before we were to leave for Southampton, Thomas took me to the harbor one last time. We stood looking out at the dark water, and he promised me everything would be different on the other side of the Atlantic. "Are you afraid?" he asked, perhaps sensing my nervousness about the deception we were about to undertake. "A little," I admitted. "What if your family discovers the truth before we reach New York?" "Then we'll face it together," he said firmly. "You're my wife, Clara. Nothing and no one can change that." He was right about the marriage certificate being our protection. But neither of us could have imagined how desperately I would need that protection, or how it would become the only thing standing between me and complete erasure from his life. As we boarded the boat train for Southampton, I clutched that certificate in my coat pocket like a lifeline. Thomas had insisted I carry it with me always, along with our wedding rings and the few photographs we'd taken together in secret. "These are our proof," he'd said. "Whatever happens, these documents prove we belong together." Looking back now, I realize how naive we were to think love could conquer the kind of prejudice and power the Sullivan family wielded. But in that moment, sailing toward our new life aboard the most magnificent ship ever built, anything seemed possible. The first time I saw the Titanic, I actually gasped. Nothing could have prepared me for the sheer size and majesty of that ship. She sat in Southampton harbor like a floating palace, her 4 massive funnels reaching toward the sky, and her black hull gleaming in the April sunlight. Passengers in their finest clothes streamed up the gangways, while porters loaded an endless procession of trunks and cases. Thomas and I stood on the dock, momentarily overwhelmed by the spectacle. "She's beautiful," I whispered, squeezing his arm. "Not as beautiful as you," he replied, and I blushed at the compliment. He'd insisted I have new clothes made for the voyage, elegant dresses suitable for first-class dining, evening gowns for the grand ballroom, and day clothes finer than anything I'd ever owned. For the first time in my life, I looked the part of a gentleman's wife. Our stateroom was more luxurious than any hotel room I'd ever imagined. Deep carpets, polished wood paneling, and a private bathroom with running water. Thomas had booked a cabin with a porthole, and I spent the first hour just staring out at the harbor, hardly believing this was real. "Mrs. Sullivan," Thomas said formally, offering me his arm as we prepared for our first dinner aboard ship. "Shall we go meet our fellow passengers?" Hearing him call me by my married name in public sent a thrill through me. After months of secrecy, we were finally living as husband and wife. The dining room was a vision of elegance, crystal white tablecloths, and silver service that gleamed under the electric lights. We were seated at a table with other first-class passengers, a banker from London, a steel magnate from Pittsburgh, and their wives. "And what business are you in, Mr. Sullivan?" asked the banker, as we enjoyed our soup course. "Textiles," Thomas replied smoothly. "I'm establishing new operations in New York." "Ah, a growing field. And Mrs. Sullivan, how are you finding the voyage?" I'd been dreading this moment, the first time I'd have to hold my own in polite society, but Thomas had prepared me well during our secret courtship, sharing stories of his own upbringing and coaching me on proper etiquette. "It's magnificent," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I've never experienced anything quite like it." The conversation flowed easily after that. Thomas was charming and knowledgeable, and I found myself relaxing into the role of his wife. These people accepted me without question. Why wouldn't they? I was traveling for properly dressed, and clearly belonged with Thomas. For the first time, I understood what our new life could be like. Our days aboard ship fell into a wonderful rhythm. We'd breakfast in the cafe, take walks on the promenade deck, and spend afternoons in the reading room or smoking lounge. Thomas had brought business papers to review, but mostly we just enjoyed being together without having to hide our relationship. The evening of April 13th was particularly magical. The ship's orchestra played in the grand ballroom, and Thomas and I danced until nearly midnight. I wore a pale blue silk gown he'd bought me in London, and I felt like a princess in his arms. "I've been thinking about our life in New York," he said as we swayed to the music. "I want to rent a house, nothing too grand, but with enough space for children someday." Children. We'd talked about it before, but hearing him mention it so casually, surrounded by all this luxury, made it seem real. "How many children?" I asked, laughing. "3, maybe 4. I want them to grow up knowing their parents chose love over convention." During our final full day at sea, Thomas showed me his grandfather's watch, a beautiful gold timepiece that had been passed down through 3 generations of Sullivan men. "Someday, this will go to our son," he said, winding it carefully, along with the story of how his parents met in a textile mill and fell in love despite everything. That evening, we dined on the finest meal I'd ever tasted. The menu was printed on cream-colored paper with gold lettering: consomme, roasted duckling, lamb with mint sauce, and chocolate soufflé. Thomas ordered champagne to celebrate our last night aboard ship. "2 new beginnings," he toasted, raising his glass. "To us," I replied, touching my glass to his dot. We talked late into the night about our plans. Thomas had already arranged for us to stay at a hotel in Manhattan while we looked for a house. He'd meet with his new employers on Monday, and I would begin the process of setting up our household. We'd been married for 6 months in secret, but our real life together was just beginning. "I can't wait to write to Father O'Brien and tell him how happy we are," I said as we prepared for bed. "He'll be so pleased to know his secret ceremony led to such joy." Thomas pulled me close. "I love you, Mrs. Sullivan, more than I ever thought possible. And I love you, Mr. Sullivan." We fell asleep in each other's arms, the gentle motion of the ship rocking us like a cradle. Neither of us could have imagined that those would be the last peaceful hours we'd ever share, or that the next evening would tear us apart forever. April 14th, 1912. Even now, 66 years later, I remember every detail of that day with painful clarity. We were supposed to dock in New York the next morning, and the excitement aboard ship was palpable. Passengers packed their belongings, exchanged addresses, and made plans to meet again in America. Thomas and I spent the morning on deck, watching the Atlantic stretch endlessly in every direction. The weather was calm, almost eerily so, with barely a ripple on the surface. Perfect conditions for our arrival. Thomas observed, checking his grandfather's pocket watch. It read 11:30 a.m. We had lunch in the a la carte restaurant, splurging on one final elegant meal. Thomas seemed different, that day more serious, more contemplative. I've been thinking about my family, he said over coffee. About how they'll react when they learn about us. We don't have to tell them immediately, I suggested. We could wait until we're settled, until you've proven yourself in New York. No, he said firmly. I'm tired of hiding. I want to write to my mother tomorrow, from our hotel in New York. I want her to know that I'm married to a wonderful woman who makes me happier than I ever thought possible. The afternoon passed peacefully. Thomas worked on some business correspondence while I wrote in the journal I'd been keeping throughout our voyage. I described the luxury of first-class travel, the kindness of the crew, and my hopes for our life in America. I ended that final entry with, "Tomorrow begins our real life together as husband and wife." I can hardly contain my excitement. Dinner that evening was especially festive. The ship's band played lively tunes, and there was a celebratory atmosphere throughout the dining room. Thomas ordered wine with our meal, and we toasted our imminent arrival in New York. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small, velvet box. Inside was a delicate gold locket engraved with my initials. "I wanted you to have something beautiful to mark this voyage." I opened the locket to find a tiny photograph of Thomas on one side and a lock of my hair on the other. "When did you? I had it made in London, before we sailed. I wanted you to have something that proved this time was real, that we really did this together." I put the locket on immediately, and Thomas fastened the clasp at the back of my neck. His fingers were warm against my skin, and I shivered with happiness. After dinner, we walked the deck under the stars. The night was crystal clear but bitterly cold, with no moon. Thomas put his arm around me as we leaned against the railing. "I keep thinking about the house we'll find," he said. "Maybe something with a garden where you can grow flowers. You mentioned, once, that you'd always wanted a garden. And a library," I added, "with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a fireplace where we can read together in the evenings." We went to bed around 10:30, both exhausted from the excitement of the day. Thomas was still holding me when I felt the ship shudder. It was subtle. At first, just a slight vibration that ran through the hull. Then, it happened again, more violently. "What was that?" I asked, sitting up in bed. Thomas was already moving toward the porthole. "I don't know. The engines have stopped." We could hear voices in the corridor outside our cabin, not panicked, but concerned. Thomas dressed quickly and opened our door to find other passengers emerging from their rooms, all asking the same questions. "I'll go find out what's happening," Thomas said, pulling on his coat. "Stay here." But I couldn't stay. I dressed hurriedly and followed him to the deck, where we found clusters of passengers looking out at the dark water. That's when I saw it, a massive iceberg drifting past the ship, its white surface gleaming in the starlight. "We hit it," a crew member was explaining to a small group. "But don't worry, this ship is unsinkable. They're checking for damage now." Thomas and I exchanged a look. Something in the crew member's tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as us. We went back to our cabin, but neither of us could sleep. An hour later, we heard the sound of lifeboats being uncovered on the deck above us. "Thomas," I whispered, suddenly afraid. "It's probably just a precaution," he said, but he was already getting dressed again. "Let's go see what's happening." This time, when we reached the deck, the scene was different. Crew members were loading women and children into lifeboats, and there was an urgency that hadn't been there before. The ship had developed a noticeable list to starboard. "All women and children to the boats," an officer called out. "This is not a drill." Thomas's face went pale. He grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the nearest lifeboat. "Clara, you need to get in." "No," I said immediately. "I'm not leaving you." "The boat is sinking," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "You have to go. Then come with me. They're not taking men yet, but I'll be right behind you, I promise." I looked at the lifeboat half empty, with women and children huddled together under blankets. The crew was calling for more passengers, but many people still didn't believe the ship was really in danger. "I can't leave you," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Thomas took my face in his hands. "Listen to me. You're my wife. You're the most important thing in my life. I need you to be safe." He pulled his grandfather's watch from his pocket and pressed it into my hands. "Take this. Keep it safe for me. Thomas, I love you," he said, kissing me one last time. "Remember that, no matter what happens, remember that I love you." The crew member was calling for final passengers. Thomas literally lifted me into the boat, despite my protests. As we began to lower, I watched him standing on the deck, his hand raised in farewell. "I'll find you," he called down. "I'll find you in New York." Those were the last words I ever heard him speak. That pocket watch in my hands had stopped at exactly 11:40 p.m., the moment our ship struck the iceberg and our life together began to end. The hours in that lifeboat were the longest of my life. We sat huddled together in the freezing Atlantic night, 32 women and children in a boat meant for 65. The crew member who commanded our boat kept us rowing away from the Titanic, saying we needed to avoid the suction when she went down. I couldn't stop watching the ship. Even from a distance, I could see her lights still blazing, could hear the band playing hymns on the deck. People were moving about like tiny figures against the illuminated windows. Somewhere among them was Thomas, and I strained my eyes, trying to spot him. "She can't really sink, can she?" asked the woman next to me, a young mother clutching her infant son. "They said she was unsinkable." I had no answer. I clutched Thomas's pocket watch so tightly that its edges cut into my palm. The watch had stopped at 11:40, but time seemed suspended in that lifeboat. Minutes felt like hours as we watched and waited. Around 2:20 in the morning, the impossible happened. The Titanic's lights flickered once, then went out completely. In the darkness, we heard a sound I'll never forget, the groaning, cracking noise of a ship breaking apart. Then she was gone, swallowed by the black water as if she'd never existed. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then came the cries, hundreds of voices calling for help from the freezing water. Our boat was too far away to help, and our crew member refused to go back. "We'll be swamped," he said. "We'll all die." I wanted to scream at him, to demand we try to save someone, anyone, but I was frozen, not just from the cold but from the terrible realization that Thomas was gone. My husband was somewhere in that dark water, and I was helpless to save him. A woman across from me began praying the rosary, her voice steady despite her tears. Others joined in, and soon our entire boat was whispering prayers into the night. I tried to pray too, but the words wouldn't come. How could I pray when my whole world had just disappeared beneath the waves? When dawn broke, we saw the Carpathia approaching. The rescue ship looked like salvation itself, smoke pouring from her funnels as she raced toward us. But as they pulled our boat alongside and crew members helped us climb the rope ladder, I realized my ordeal was just beginning. On the Carpathia's deck, wrapped in the rough wool blanket they gave me, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my life. A ship's officer approached with a clipboard, taking down names for the survivor list. "Name?" he asked efficiently. I hesitated. I could say Clara Whitfield and return to my old life, pretending the marriage had never happened. Or I could claim my rightful name and face whatever consequences came with it. "Mrs. Thomas Sullivan," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. The officer wrote it down without question. Around me, other survivors were reuniting with family members who'd been in different boats. I saw wives finding husbands, children finding parents, but I stood alone, scanning the crowd for a face I knew would never appear. A kind woman from first class, Mrs. Margaret Brown, noticed my isolation. "Have you found your husband, dear?" she asked gently. "No," I whispered. "He didn't make it off the ship." Double quotes. Mrs. Brown's face crumpled with sympathy. She pulled me close, and for the first time since the disaster, I allowed myself to cry. This stranger held me while I sobbed for Thomas, for our lost future, for the life we'd never have. During the 3-day voyage to New York, I learned the full scope of the tragedy. More than 1,500 people had died, including most of the men from first class who'd followed the women and children first protocol. Thomas had died a hero's death, staying behind to help others escape. But I also learned something else that chilled me to the bone. Another survivor, a businessman, who'd known the Sullivan family, approached me on our second day at sea. "I'm sorry for your loss, my dear," he said kindly. "Thomas was a good man. His family will be devastated." "You know his family?" I asked. "Oh yes, I've done business with old Sullivan for years. Margaret, that's his mother, she's a formidable woman, runs in the best social circles. She wants to arrange a proper memorial service, I'm sure." The way he spoke made it clear he had no idea Thomas had been married. To this man, to Thomas's family, to the world. I was just another survivor. The secret we'd kept so carefully was about to become my greatest enemy. As the Carpathia steamed toward New York, I made a decision that would take more courage than I knew I possessed. I would contact Thomas's family. I would tell them about our marriage and claim my rightful place as his widow. I owed him that much, and I owed it to our love. But first, I had to figure out how to prove that a factory girl from Boston had really been the wife of one of the wealthiest young men in America. All I had was a marriage certificate, some love letters, and a pocket watch that had stopped at the moment our world ended. New York Harbor was chaos when the Carpathia docked on April 18th. Thousands of people crowded the pier, holding photographs and calling out names of missing loved ones. Reporters pushed through the crowd, shouting questions at survivors as we stumbled down the gangway. I felt overwhelmed by the noise and confusion. After 3 days of quiet grief at sea, I had no family waiting for me, no familiar face in the crowd. Mrs. Brown had kindly offered to help me find lodging, but I knew what I had to do first. I needed to contact the Sullivan family, and I needed to do it properly. The Red Cross had set up a station to help survivors, and I approached one of their volunteers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and efficient manner. I need to contact the family of my husband, I explained. He didn't survive, and they don't know about our marriage. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. They don't know you were married. We eloped, I said simply. It's complicated. She helped me send a telegram to the Sullivan house in Boston. Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, I am Clara Sullivan, widow of your son Thomas, lost aboard Titanic. Request meeting to discuss arrangements. Most urgent. Clara. I chose my words carefully, trying to sound respectable while making it clear this wasn't a hoax. Then I waited. The response came within hours, delivered to the modest hotel where the Red Cross had arranged my temporary lodging, but it wasn't what I expected. Instead of a telegram, a man in an expensive suit knocked on my door. Miss Whitfield, I presume, he said when I answered. His tone was cool, professional. I'm William Hartwell, attorney for the Sullivan family. Mrs. Sullivan received your telegram and asked me to investigate this matter personally. The fact that he called me Miss Whitfield rather than Mrs. Sullivan told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation would go. It's Mrs. Sullivan, I corrected him, but he ignored the correction. May I come in? This is a delicate matter, and these hotel corridors have ears. I let him into my small room, suddenly conscious of how shabby everything looked. My borrowed clothes, the simple furnishings, the few possessions I'd managed to save from the ship. Mr. Hartwell sat in the room's only chair and pulled out a leather portfolio. Miss Whitfield, I understand you've suffered a terrible trauma. The Titanic disaster has affected many people in unexpected ways. Sometimes grief can cause confusion, false memories. I'm not confused, I interrupted. Thomas Sullivan was my husband. We were married last October at St. Patrick's Church in Boston. Do you have proof of this alleged marriage? I produced our marriage certificate from my coat pocket, along with the small collection of love letters Thomas had written me. Mr. Hartwell examined them with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to spotting forgeries. These could easily be fabricated, he said finally. The certificate appears genuine, but documents can be falsified. As for these letters, he gestured dismissively at Thomas's passionate words. They prove nothing more than a possible infatuation. I felt my cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. Are you calling me a liar? I'm saying that Mrs. Sullivan is a woman of considerable means and social standing. She's naturally cautious about people who might try to take advantage of her grief. Surely you understand her position. And what exactly is her position? Mr. Hartwell's expression hardened. That her son was a responsible young man who would never have married without his family's knowledge or blessing. That any such marriage, if it existed, would have been announced properly in the social pages. That she has no knowledge of any romantic attachment her son might have formed. He was going to tell her, I said desperately. He'd written a letter, explaining everything. He planned to send it from New York. Convenient that this letter was supposedly lost with the ship. Mr. Hartwell observed dryly. I realized then that I was fighting a battle I couldn't win, not with words alone. These people had made up their minds before Mr. Hartwell ever knocked on my door. To them, I was exactly what I looked like, a working-class girl trying to claim an inheritance she didn't deserve. Mrs. Sullivan would like to offer you a settlement, the lawyer continued, pulling out a bank draft. $500 to help you rebuild your life after this tragedy. All she asks in return is that you cease making these claims about her son. $500 was more money than I'd ever seen at one time. It was enough to start over somewhere far from Boston, far from the memories. But taking it would mean accepting that my marriage to Thomas had never happened, that our love had been meaningless. No, I said, pushing the draft away. I won't take your money, and I won't stop telling the truth. Mr. Hartwell sighed and returned the draft to his portfolio. I'm sorry to hear that, Miss Whitfield. Mrs. Sullivan hoped this could be resolved amicably. What does that mean? It means that if you continue to make these false claims, the Sullivan family will be forced to take legal action. They will not allow their son's memory to be tainted by scandal. After he left, I sat alone in that dreary hotel room and cried until I had no tears left. I'd thought the worst thing that could happen was losing Thomas. I'd never imagined that his family would try to erase me entirely, as if our love had never existed. But I still had the marriage certificate. I still had his letters, his grandfather's watch, and the locket he'd given me on our last night together. Most importantly, I had the truth. Somehow, I would find a way to make them acknowledge it. The next morning brought news that made my situation even more desperate. The hotel clerk handed me a newspaper with Thomas's obituary on the front page. Thomas Michael Sullivan, 26, heir to Sullivan textile fortune, perished aboard RMS Titanic, survived by parents Michael and Margaret Sullivan and sister Catherine. Memorial service to be held Friday at Trinity Church. No mention of a wife. No mention of me at all. As far as the world knew, Thomas Sullivan had died a bachelor, and I was just another anonymous survivor with no connection to his family. The days following my encounter with Mr. Hartwell were the darkest of my life. I was trapped in a strange city with limited funds, no family, and no friends except the few fellow survivors who'd shown me kindness. Worse, I was beginning to understand the full power of the Sullivan family's influence. The hotel clerk, who'd been friendly before, became noticeably cooler after Mr. Hartwell's visit. When I asked about extending my stay, he informed me that my room had been accidentally double-booked, and I'd need to find other accommodations. The Red Cross volunteer who'd helped me send the telegram suddenly became unavailable when I sought her assistance again. I found cheaper lodging in a boarding house on the Lower East Side, sharing a room with 2 other women who worked in the garment district. It was a step down from even my old life in Boston, but it was all I could afford. My fellow boarders were kind enough, but they looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion when I tried to explain my situation. "You were married to a rich man?" asked Mary, a seamstress from Ireland. "But where's your money then? Where are your fine clothes and jewelry?" How could I explain that my husband's family refused to acknowledge our marriage, that they had the power to simply erase me from his life? It sounded unbelievable even to me. I decided to attend Thomas's memorial service, despite knowing I wouldn't be welcome. I needed to see his family face to face, to make them acknowledge my existence. I borrowed a black dress from one of my roommates and pinned my hair up in the most respectable style I could manage. Trinity Church was packed with Boston's social elite. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to blend in with the crowd. The service was beautiful solemn hymns, eloquent speeches about Thomas's character and potential, flowers that must have cost more than most people earned in a year. When Margaret Sullivan rose to speak about her son, I felt my heart break all over again. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, dressed in the finest mourning attire, her voice steady despite her obvious grief. "My son Thomas was a young man of principle and purpose," she said. "He believed in hard work, in treating all people with dignity, in building something meaningful with his life. He died as he lived, putting others before himself." Everything she said about Thomas was true. He had been principled, hard-working, and selfless. But as she spoke about his dreams and ambitions, she made no mention of his plans to start fresh in New York, of his desire to improve working conditions, of his love for a factory girl who'd captured his heart. After the service, I watched the family receive condolences from their friends and colleagues. Margaret Sullivan stood between her husband and daughter, accepting embraces and murmured sympathies with dignified grace. I wanted to approach her, to force her to look at me, and acknowledge that I belonged there too. But my courage failed me. Instead, I followed the funeral procession to the cemetery from a distance. As they lowered Thomas's empty casket, his body was never recovered. I stood behind a large monument, close enough to hear Margaret Sullivan's final words to her son. "Rest in peace, my dear boy," she whispered. "Mama will make sure your memory is protected." Protected from what? From the truth about his marriage, from the knowledge that he'd found love outside his social class. That evening, I returned to my boarding house to find a letter waiting for me. It was from Mr. Hartwell, and its contents made my blood run cold. Miss Whitfield, it has come to our attention that you attended services for the late Thomas Sullivan despite being expressly asked to avoid contact with the family. This behavior constitutes harassment and will not be tolerated. Be advised that the Sullivan family has engaged private investigators to look into your background and claims. Any attempt to contact family members, attend family events, or otherwise insert yourself into their grief will result in legal action. We trust you understand the seriousness of this matter. Private investigators, they were actually paying people to dig into my life, probably hoping to find something they could use to discredit me. The thought terrified me. What if they discovered something that could be twisted to make me look dishonest or unstable? I spent the next week looking over my shoulder, wondering if the men I saw on street corners or in the boarding house lobby were watching me. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was nothing compared to the emotional toll of being systematically erased from Thomas's life. A week after the memorial service, I saw an announcement in the society pages that made me physically ill. The Sullivan family was establishing a scholarship fund in Thomas's memory, the Thomas Michael Sullivan Memorial Scholarship for Deserving Young Men. The description emphasized Thomas's commitment to education and his bright future in business. Deserving young men, not women, certainly not working-class women like the one he'd actually married. The scholarship would help boys from good families attend Harvard, just as Thomas had. It was a fitting memorial for the man his family wanted him to have been, not the man he actually was. That night, I wrote a letter to Margaret Sullivan, pouring out my heart on paper. I told her about meeting Thomas at the factory, about his kindness to the workers, about his dreams of treating employees better than his father had. I described our courtship, our secret marriage, our plans for a more egalitarian life in New York. I begged her to remember the son who'd cared more about justice than social status. I never sent the letter. I knew it would only result in another threatening note from Mr. Hartwell, possibly accompanied by legal action. Instead, I kept it as a record of the truth, along with Thomas's letters and our marriage certificate. 3 weeks after the Titanic sank, I was surviving day to day, taking in sewing to pay for my room and board. My savings were nearly gone, and I was beginning to think about returning to factory work if I could find a mill that would hire a woman with my reputation. The Sullivan family's influence seemed to extend everywhere in BAFTA's business community, but then something happened that changed everything. The White Star Line finally released the official passenger manifest, the complete list of everyone who'd been aboard the Titanic, organized by class and cabin assignment. And there, in black and white under first-class passengers, were 2 names that would transform my fight for recognition: Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Sullivan. I first saw those letters bundled in blue ribbon, hidden in the lining of Thomas's coat, the coat I'd carefully preserved along with his other belongings from our cabin. During those long, lonely weeks after his memorial service, I'd taken to holding his things, trying to feel close to him somehow. That's when I discovered the small tear in the coat's silk lining and felt the crinkle of paper beneath. My hands shook as I carefully extracted the letters. There were 7 of them, written in Thomas's familiar handwriting, all addressed to me. The first was dated just 2 weeks after our secret marriage. My dearest Clara, I find myself thinking of you constantly during the long hours at the factory. Watching you work, knowing you are my wife, but unable to acknowledge it publicly, fills me with both joy and frustration. Soon, my darling, we will be free to love each other openly. Reading his words again, months after his death, brought both comfort and agony. He'd poured his heart onto these pages, describing his dreams for our future, his impatience with the secrecy, his growing love for me. But it was the final letter, dated April 8th, just 2 days before we sailed, that took my breath away. My beloved wife, by the time you read this, we will be in New York and I will have told my family about our marriage. I know Mother will be shocked, perhaps even angry, but she will come to love you as I do. How could she not? You have made me a better man, Clara. You have shown me what really matters in life. Not money or social position, but love, kindness, and genuine human connection. I have written to Mother separately, explaining our situation and asking for her blessing. That letter waits in my desk, to be sent from New York. I want her to understand that I chose you not in spite of who you are, but because of who you are. You are my heart's true companion, and I am proud to call you my wife." Tears streamed down my face as I read those words. Thomas had written to his mother. Somewhere in his family's possession was a letter that would prove everything I'd been trying to tell them. But how could I get them to acknowledge it? The other letters revealed the depth of Thomas's commitment to our marriage and his frustration with having to hide it. In one, he wrote about a conversation with his father about work conditions. "Father still sees the mill hands as expenses rather than human beings. I tried to suggest improvements to the working conditions, but he dismissed my ideas as sentimental nonsense. He has no idea that I'm married to one of those expenses, that I've seen firsthand how hard these women work for so little compensation. When we're established in New York, I plan to implement the changes Father refuses to consider." Another letter described his growing impatience with Boston society. "I attended another tedious dinner party last night, filled with the same shallow conversations about who's marrying whom and which families are gaining or losing social standing. All I could think about was coming home to you, to real conversation about books and ideas and dreams. These people would be scandalized to know that my greatest happiness comes from talking with a factory girl about poetry and politics." The final letter, written the night before we left for Southampton, was the most precious. "Tomorrow, we begin our real life together, and I can hardly contain my excitement. No more hiding, no more pretending, no more caring what society thinks about our love. You are my wife, Clara, in every way that matters. Whatever challenges we face in New York, we'll face them together. I love you more than words can express, and I promise to spend every day of our life proving that love to you." As I held these letters, I realized they were more than just expressions of love. They were proof of Thomas's state of mind, evidence of his commitment to our marriage, and his plans to make it public. But they also highlighted the cruelty of what his family was doing to me. Thomas had loved me exactly as I was, had been proud to call me his wife, had been planning to introduce me to his family as their daughter-in-law. The weight of my isolation became almost unbearable. I had these beautiful letters proving Thomas's love, but no one to share them with, no one who would understand their significance. The other women in my boarding house were kind but couldn't comprehend the complexity of my situation. The few Titanic survivors I'd stayed in contact with had their own grief to bear. I began writing in my journal more frequently, documenting not just my daily struggles but also my memories of Thomas, our conversations, his dreams, the little things that had made him special. I wrote about his laugh, the way he'd absently wind his grandfather's watch when he was thinking, his habit of bringing me books he thought I'd enjoy. He saw me, I wrote one evening by lamplight, in a world where women like me are invisible. He truly saw me. He valued my thoughts, my opinions, my dreams. He made me believe I was worthy of love and respect. His family would strip all of that away if they could, reduce me to nothing more than a grasping opportunist. But I know the truth. These letters know the truth. The letters also revealed something else important: Thomas's plan to access his inheritance. He'd written about his New York lawyer's confidence that the marriage certificate would be sufficient to claim the trust fund his grandfather had established. "The law is clear," he'd written. "Grandfather's will specifies that I inherit upon marriage, without requiring family approval. Our certificate from St. Patrick's is all the documentation needed." This gave me hope. If Thomas had been right about the legal aspects, perhaps I did have rights that couldn't be dismissed so easily. But I also knew I'd need legal help, that I couldn't afford on my own. As May turned to June, I made a decision that would require every ounce of courage I possessed. I would find a lawyer willing to take my case, even if it meant going into debt I might never be able to repay. The Sullivan family had money and influence, but they didn't have the truth on their side. I had the marriage certificate. I had Thomas's love letters proving his intentions. I had his grandfather's watch and the locket he'd given me. Most importantly, I had the memory of a man who'd believed I was worth fighting for. Now I would have to prove I was worth fighting for myself. Finding a lawyer willing to take on the Sullivan family proved nearly impossible. I spent 2 weeks visiting law offices throughout Boston, carrying my small collection of documents in a worn leather satchel. Most attorneys wouldn't even see me once I explained my situation. Their secretaries would return with polite but firm rejections. "Mr. So-and-so is unable to take on new clients at this time." The few lawyers who did agree to meet with me made it clear they had no interest in challenging one of Boston's most prominent families. "Even if your claim has merit," one elderly attorney told me, The cost of litigation would far exceed any potential recovery. The Sullivans have unlimited resources to drag out legal proceedings. I was beginning to despair when I found Samuel Morrison, a young lawyer working out of a modest office near the harbor. Unlike the established firms in downtown Boston, Mr. Morrison seemed genuinely interested in my story. He was perhaps 30 years old, earnest and idealistic, with the kind of passion for justice that hadn't yet been worn down by years of practice. "Tell me everything," he said, gesturing for me to sit in the worn chair across from his desk. "Start from the beginning and leave nothing out." I spent 2 hours describing my relationship with Thomas, our secret marriage, the voyage on the Titanic, and the Sullivan family's subsequent treatment of me. Mr. Morrison took careful notes, asking pointed questions about dates, witnesses, and documentation. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me thoughtfully. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, and I felt a rush of gratitude at hearing someone use my married name. "You have a legitimate legal claim. The marriage certificate appears genuine, and Massachusetts law is clear about spousal inheritance rights, but," I could hear the hesitation in his voice, "but you're right to be concerned about the practical challenges. The Sullivan family has significant influence in this city. They can make this case very expensive and very unpleasant for all involved." He explained the legal process that would be required to assert my rights as Thomas's widow. "We would need to file a formal claim against his estate, present evidence of our marriage, and potentially go to trial if the family contested our claim." "What would it cost?" I asked, dreading the answer. "More than you can afford," he said honestly. "However, I'm willing to take your case on a contingency basis. I'll cover the court costs and legal fees in exchange for a percentage of any settlement or judgment we obtain." It was a generous offer, but it came with a warning. "Mrs. Sullivan, this won't be just a legal battle, it will be a war. The Sullivan family will try to destroy your reputation, question your character, and paint you as a fortune hunter. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Thomas's letters, about his love and respect for me, about his plans to introduce me proudly to his family. "Yes," I said firmly, "I'm prepared." Mr. Morrison smiled for the first time since I'd entered his office. "Good, then let's begin." The first step was filing a formal petition with the probate court, asserting my claim as Thomas's legal widow and demanding my share of his estate. Mr. Morrison explained that under Massachusetts law, I was entitled to at least 1/3 of Thomas's inheritance, plus certain personal property. We also discovered something that strengthened our case considerably. Thomas's grandfather's will, which was a matter of public record, contained specific language about his grandson's future marriage. The trust fund was to be released upon Thomas's marriage to any woman of good character, said marriage to be verified by appropriate legal documentation. "Notice it doesn't say anything about family approval," Mr. Morrison pointed out. "Your grandfather-in-law was apparently more progressive than his son and daughter." The formal filing of our petition created exactly the storm Mr. Morrison had predicted. Within days, I received a letter from Mr. Hartwell that was even more threatening than his previous correspondence. "Miss Whitfield, your continued harassment of our clients through frivolous legal action constitutes malicious prosecution. Be advised that the Sullivan family will vigorously defend against your baseless claims and will seek full damages and attorney fees when your suit is dismissed. Additionally, we have obtained information about your background that calls into question your character and credibility. We suggest you withdraw this action immediately to avoid public embarrassment." The threat about information concerning my background worried me. What could they have possibly found? I'd lived a simple, honest life, but I'd learned enough about the Sullivan family's influence to know they might be capable of manufacturing evidence if none existed. Mr. Morrison was undeterred. "Empty threats," he said dismissively. "If they had damaging information, they would have already used it. This is just an attempt to intimidate you." The real test came when the Sullivan family filed their response to our petition. Their answer, drafted by a team of expensive lawyers, was a masterpiece of character assassination, disguised as legal argument. They claimed I was a person of loose morals who had pursued their son for mercenary purposes. They alleged that any relationship between Thomas and me had been entirely one-sided and based upon plaintiff's false representations. Most painfully, they suggested that I had taken advantage of a young man's temporary infatuation for personal gain. Reading their response felt like being slapped. These people had never met me, had never spoken to me beyond that one encounter with Mr. Hartwell. yet they felt qualified to judge my character and motivations. They were trying to reduce my love for Thomas to a calculated scheme for financial advancement. But Mr. Morrison had good news. As part of the legal discovery process, we were entitled to examine Thomas's personal effects and papers, including any correspondence he might have left behind. If the letter Thomas had mentioned writing to his mother actually existed, we might be able to compel its production. They have to turn over everything, Mr. Morrison explained. Love letters, personal papers, even private family correspondence, if it's relevant to the case. If your husband wrote to his mother about your marriage, we'll find it. The thought of Thomas's letter existing somewhere in the Sullivan house, possibly hidden away or even destroyed, filled me with both hope and anguish. That letter could vindicate everything I'd been saying, prove that Thomas had been proud of our marriage and planning to announce it as we prepared for the discovery phase of the litigation. I clung to the faith that truth would ultimately prevail. Thomas had loved me enough to marry me in secret, to plan a life together, to buy first-class tickets so we could travel as husband and wife. His family might have the power to make my life difficult, but they couldn't change the fundamental facts of our relationship. The official passenger list had already proved that Thomas had registered us as Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Sullivan. Soon, I hoped, his own words would prove that he'd been ready to claim me publicly as his wife. 3 weeks after filing our legal petition, the document that would change everything arrived at Mr. Morrison's office in a manila envelope marked White Star Line, Official Records. Inside was the complete passenger manifest for the RMS Titanic, meticulously compiled from booking records, boarding passes, and crew logs. I was sitting across from Mr. Morrison's desk when he opened the envelope, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. We'd been waiting for this official documentation, hoping it would support my claim but not entirely sure what we'd find. Here we are, Mr. Morrison said, running his finger down the first-class passenger list. Cabina numberless, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Sullivan. The relief that washed over me was so intense, I nearly wept. There it was, in black and white. Official documentation that couldn't be disputed or dismissed. Thomas had booked our passage as a married couple. He'd registered us with the ship's purser as husband and wife, to the White Star Line, to the British Board of Trade, to history itself. We were Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Sullivan. This changes everything, Mr. Morrison said, his voice filled with excitement. They can claim your marriage certificate is fraudulent, they can question your character, but they cannot dispute an official government document. This passenger manifest was compiled before the ship sailed and filed with maritime authorities. He was right. The manifest proved that Thomas had publicly acknowledged our marriage, at least in the context of our voyage. He hadn't tried to hide me or travel under false names. He'd proudly claimed me as his wife to the ship's officers and crew. But the manifest revealed something else that took my breath away. In the margin next to our names, someone had written in neat handwriting, "Newlyweds, special accommodation, requested." Thomas had apparently asked for and received some kind of special treatment for us as a newly married couple. What kind of special accommodation? I asked. Mr. Morrison studied the notation. We'll need to request the full booking records, but this suggests your husband made specific arrangements recognizing your status as newlyweds, perhaps upgraded cabin assignments, special dining arrangements, or preferential service. The booking records, when they arrived 2 days later, painted a picture of a man deeply proud of his new wife. Thomas had indeed requested special considerations, champagne service on our first night aboard, flowers delivered to our cabin each morning, and priority seating in the ship's first-class dining room. More importantly, the records included a copy of the form Thomas had filled out when making our reservation. Under purpose of travel, he'd written, honeymoon voyage to establish new residence in New York. Under emergency contact, he'd listed both his parents in Boston and wife's family, none. That last notation broke my heart all over again. Thomas had understood that I was truly alone in the world, that he was my only family. Yet it also strengthened our legal position by showing he'd considered all aspects of our relationship when making official arrangements. Mr. Morrison immediately sent copies of the passenger manifest and booking records to the Sullivan family's lawyers, along with a formal demand that they acknowledge my status as Thomas's widow. The response came within days, and it was more desperate than anything we'd received before. Mr. Hartwell's letter was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering and barely concealed panic. The booking records proved nothing more than that the deceased may have been temporarily infatuated with your client. Young men often engage in romantic fantasies while traveling. The fact that he may have registered her under an assumed name for purposes of shipboard companionship does not constitute legal marriage. Assumed name, shipboard companionship. They were suggesting that Thomas had essentially hired me as a traveling companion and registered me as his wife for improper purposes. The accusation was so insulting, so contrary to everything I knew about Thomas's character, that I felt physically sick reading it. But Mr. Morrison was delighted with their response. "They're getting desperate," he explained. "When lawyers start making arguments this week, it means they know they're losing. No one will believe that a Sullivan heir would engage in such behavior, especially when we have your marriage certificate to prove the relationship was legitimate." The passenger manifest had another unexpected effect. It began to change public opinion. Word of the discovery leaked to the newspapers, and suddenly my story was being covered as a human interest piece, rather than a scandalous fraud. "Titanic widow fights for recognition," read one headline. "Love lost at sea. Factory girl's secret marriage to Boston heir," proclaimed another. The newspaper coverage brought me something I desperately needed: supporters. Other Titanic survivors began reaching out, sharing their own stories of loss and official indifference. Several women's rights organizations offered their assistance, seeing my case as an example of how society dismissed working-class women's claims. Most importantly, people who had known Thomas began to come forward. A former Harvard classmate wrote to Mr. Morrison describing how Thomas had seemed different in his final months at school, happier, more purposeful, and often distracted, as if his mind was elsewhere. "He mentioned being in love," the classmate wrote, "but said he couldn't discuss it yet because the situation was complicated." A supervisor from the textile mill provided an affidavit stating that Thomas had indeed spent considerable time in my section of the factory and had seemed genuinely interested in worker welfare. Mr. Sullivan asked many questions about Miss Whitefield's work and abilities, the supervisor recalled. He seemed to hold her in high regard. Even some members of Boston society began to express doubts about the Sullivan family's position. One socialite was quoted in the newspaper saying, "If young Thomas did marry this girl, his family should honor that choice rather than trying to hide it. Love doesn't recognize class boundaries." Margaret Sullivan, for her part, maintained absolute silence. She refused all interview requests and apparently instructed her friends and family to do the same. But her silence was telling. If she'd been certain of her position, she would have spoken publicly to defend her son's reputation. That as summer turned to fall, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since Thomas's death. The passenger manifest had provided the objective proof we needed, and public opinion was slowly shifting in my favor. Mr. Morrison was confident we would prevail when the case went to trial. But the Sullivan family had one more card to play, and it would nearly destroy everything we'd worked to build. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by hand to my boarding house. The envelope was expensive cream-colored paper with Margaret Sullivan embossed in elegant script across the top. After months of communication only through lawyers, Thomas's mother was finally writing to me directly. My hands trembled as I opened it, partly from nervousness and partly from hope. Perhaps the passenger manifest had convinced her to acknowledge our marriage. Perhaps she was ready to welcome me into the family as Thomas had always hoped she would. Instead, the letter contained the most devastating words I'd ever read. "Miss Whitfield, I write to inform you that yesterday, while reviewing my late son's personal effects, I discovered a letter he had written but never sent. As this letter directly concerns your claims about a supposed marriage, I believe you should see it before proceeding further with your frivolous litigation." Attached to her note was a single sheet of paper in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. The letter was dated April 15, 1912, the day after the Titanic sank. But that was impossible. Thomas had died when the ship went down on April 14th. How could he have written anything the following day? Then I read the letter itself, and my world collapsed. "Dearest Mother, I write this from the Carpathia, where I am recovering from the terrible ordeal of the Titanic disaster. By God's grace, I survived, though so many others did not. I know you must be frantic with worry, so I wanted to get word to you as quickly as possible that I am alive and unharmed. I must confess something that will shock you, but I hope you will understand. During the voyage, I became acquainted with a young woman named Clara Whitfield, a factory worker traveling in steerage. In the chaos of the evacuation, I helped her reach the lifeboats and told her to give my name if anyone questioned her right to first-class accommodations. I fear this well-intentioned deception may have led to confusion about our relationship. Miss Whitfield is a decent girl who found herself in an impossible situation. I hope she survives this disaster, but I wanted you to know that any claims she might make about a romantic relationship between us are based on misunderstanding. I acted only as a gentleman helping a lady in distress. I plan to book passage on the next available ship home to Boston. Please don't worry about the inheritance complications. There are none. I remain your unmarried son, looking forward to finding a proper wife when I return. Your loving son, Thomas. I read the letter 3 times before its implications fully sank in. If this letter was genuine, it destroyed everything I'd claimed about our relationship. It suggested that I was a desperate woman who'd misinterpreted Thomas's kindness for romantic interest. It made me look like exactly what the Sullivan family had always claimed, a fortune-hunting fraud, but it was impossible. I'd seen Thomas die. I'd watched him go down with the ship. He'd put me in that lifeboat himself, had given me his grandfather's watch, had told me he loved me. This letter had to be a forgery, yet the handwriting looked genuine. The paper appeared to be ship's stationery. Even the ink seemed to match other samples of Thomas's writing. If it was a forgery, it was a masterful one. I stumbled down to the boarding house's common room, where Mrs. Chen, the landlady, was reading her newspaper. She took one look at my face and immediately led me to her private parlor. "What's happened, dear?" she asked, pressing a cup of tea into my shaking hands. I couldn't speak. I just handed her the letter and Margaret Sullivan's note. Mrs. Chen read both carefully, her expression growing more concerned with each word. "This can't be right," she said finally. "You've told me so much about your husband, about your life together. This letter makes no sense, but did it? In my grief and trauma, had I somehow constructed an elaborate fantasy about my relationship with Thomas? Had his kindness to a struggling factory worker become, in my damaged mind, a great love story that never really existed? I thought about our secret meetings, our conversations about books and ideas, the way he'd looked at me when he thought no one was watching. I remembered our wedding at St. Patrick's Church, the feeling of his ring sliding onto my finger, the joy in his eyes as Father O'Brien pronounced us husband and wife. No, none of that had been my imagination. I had the marriage certificate to prove it. I had his love letters, written long before the Titanic disaster. I had the locket he'd given me, the passionate words he'd whispered in our secret moments together. This letter was a lie, but how could I prove it? I immediately took the letter to Mr. Morrison, who studied it with the same careful attention he'd given our marriage certificate months earlier. His examination was thorough. He checked the paper quality, analyzed the handwriting, even tested the ink under different lighting conditions. "It's very good," he admitted finally. "If it's a forgery, it's been done by someone with considerable skill and resources." "But it has to be a forgery," I insisted. "Thomas died on the ship. I saw him go down. The passenger manifest lists him among the dead." "I know," Mr. Morrison said gently, "and that's our strongest argument against this letter's authenticity. But we'll need expert testimony to prove forgery in court, and that's expensive." The letter's appearance had an immediate effect on our case. The Sullivan family's lawyers filed an emergency motion asking the court to dismiss my petition based on this newly discovered evidence. They argued that the letter proved I had no legitimate claim to Thomas's estate and that my entire case was based on misrepresentation. Worse, word of the letter leaked to the newspapers. "Titanic fraud exposed," screamed one headline. "Factory girl's fantasy revealed," proclaimed another. The same reporters who'd been sympathetic to my story now treated me like a criminal who'd been caught in an elaborate lie. The women's organizations that had offered support began to distance themselves. Fellow Titanic survivors stopped returning my letters. Even some of the other women in my boarding house began to look at me with suspicion. But I knew the truth. Thomas had been my husband. He had loved me. He had died on that ship while helping others to safety. This letter was an elaborate fake designed to destroy my credibility and protect the Sullivan family's reputation. The question was, how could I prove it? As I sat in my small room that night, holding Thomas's real letters against my heart, I made a decision that would require more courage than I'd ever needed before. I would fight this accusation with everything I had. I would find a way to expose this forgery and honor the memory of the man who'd loved me enough to marry me in secret, somewhere in Boston. Margaret Sullivan had the resources to create convincing forgeries and the motivation to destroy me. But she didn't have what I had: the truth, and the absolute certainty that comes from having been truly loved. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Thomas's grandfather's lawyer, a man named Edmund Fitzgerald, who had served the Sullivan family for 40 years. Mr. Fitzgerald was in his 70s, and apparently troubled by the family's treatment of me. He appeared at Mr. Morrison's office on a gray November morning, unannounced and carrying a worn leather briefcase. I happened to be there reviewing documents when his secretary showed him in. Mr. Morrison, "I'm Edmund Fitzgerald. I believe you're representing young Mrs. Sullivan in her inheritance claim." Mr. Morrison looked surprised but invited him to sit. "How can we help you, Mr. Fitzgerald?" The elderly lawyer studied me carefully before speaking. "I knew Thomas's grandfather well, helped him draft his will. In fact, old Henry Sullivan was a fair man who believed in rewarding hard work and genuine character. He would be appalled by what's happening here." He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "These are copies of the original inheritance documents, including provisions that the current family seems to have overlooked. What Mr. Fitzgerald showed us changed everything. Thomas's grandfather's will contained a clause that hadn't appeared in the summary we'd been given. The trust fund was to be released not just upon Thomas's marriage, but came with specific protections for his chosen bride. You see here," Mr. Fitzgerald pointed to a particular paragraph. "Henry was worried about exactly this situation. He'd seen too many wealthy families destroy their children's happiness by rejecting wives they deemed unsuitable. So he built in safeguards. The will specifically stated that if the family refused to acknowledge Thomas's marriage, the entire inheritance, not just Thomas's portion, but a significant part of the family's wealth, would go directly to a charity supporting working women's education. It was Henry Sullivan's way of forcing his descendants to respect his grandson's choices. But there's more," Mr. Fitzgerald continued. "Henry also required that all of Thomas's personal effects, including correspondence, be preserved and made available to his wife upon his death. The family cannot legally dispose of any of his belongings without the widow's consent. This meant that Thomas's letter to his mother, the one he'd mentioned in his letters to me, should still exist. Somewhere in the Sullivan house, the family was legally required to preserve it and turn it over to me." "Why are you telling us this?" Mr. Morrison asked. Mr. Fitzgerald's weathered face was grave. "Because I've known Margaret Sullivan since she was a young bride herself, and I've watched her become someone I no longer recognize. What she's doing to this young woman is wrong, and it dishonors her son's memory." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I also believe the letter she produced is a forgery. I've seen Thomas's handwriting countless times over the years. He signed documents in my office, wrote thank you notes for family events. The letter Margaret showed you. Something about it troubles me." After Mr. Fitzgerald left, Mr. Morrison immediately filed new motions demanding access to Thomas's personal effects and requesting a handwriting analysis of the suspicious letter. We also demanded an accounting of the full inheritance, including the provisions that would trigger the charity donation if my marriage wasn't acknowledged. The Sullivan family's response was swift and furious. Within hours, Mr. Hartwell appeared at our office with 2 other lawyers and a briefcase full of threatening documents. "Your client is engaging in extortion," he declared. "These fishing expeditions and harassment tactics will not be tolerated." But Mr. Morrison was calm and confident. "We're simply enforcing the legal requirements of Henry Sullivan's will. If your clients have nothing to hide, they shouldn't object to complying with their legal obligations." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering. The court ordered the Sullivan family to produce all of Thomas's personal effects for inspection. They were also required to submit the questionable letter for independent handwriting analysis. Margaret Sullivan fought the orders every step of the way, filing appeal after appeal, but her desperate resistance only made her look more guilty. If the letter was genuine, why wouldn't she want expert analysis to prove it? Finally, on a cold December morning, we were allowed into the Sullivan house to examine Thomas's belongings. I'd never seen such luxury: marble floors, crystal chandelier, oil paintings in gilded frames, but all I cared about was finding Thomas's real letter to his mother. His room had been preserved exactly as he'd left it. His clothes still hung in the wardrobe, his books remained on the shelves, his desk sat undisturbed. Margaret Sullivan watched, from the doorway, as Mr. Morrison and I searched through drawers and papers. "You have no right to be here," she said coldly. "This is my son's private space." Actually, under the law, Mrs. Sullivan has every right to her husband's belongings. Mr. Morrison replied calmly. "I found the letter in the third drawer of Thomas's desk, filed behind some business correspondence. It was exactly where he might have left it, written but not yet sent." My heart raced as I unfolded the familiar handwriting. "Dearest Mother, I know this letter will come as a shock, but I can no longer keep my secret from you. I am married to a wonderful woman named Clara Whitfield, and I love her more than life itself. We wed last October at St. Patrick's Church, and I am writing to ask for your blessing of our union. I know Clara is not what you expected from me. She comes from humble circumstances and works in our factory. But she is the kindest, most intelligent woman I have ever known. She makes me want to be a better man, a more just employer, a person worthy of her love. We are sailing to New York on the Titanic to start our new life together. I plan to send this letter upon our arrival, so that when we return for a visit, you will be prepared to welcome Clara as your daughter. I hope in time you will come to love her as I do. Please don't be angry that we married in secret. I knew you would have concerns, but I also knew that once you met Clara, those concerns would disappear. She is my heart's choice, Mother, and I am proud to call her my wife. Your loving son, Thomas." I was crying by the time I finished reading. Here was the proof I'd needed. Thomas's own words describing our marriage, expressing his love for me, asking his mother to accept me. This letter, combined with all our other evidence, completely vindicated my claims. But as I looked up at Margaret Sullivan's face, I saw something that surprised me. She wasn't angry or defiant anymore. She was crying too, and for the first time since I'd known of her existence, she looked like a grieving mother rather than an imperious socialite. "He really did love you," she whispered, and I realized that despite all her efforts to deny it, she'd always known the truth. The confrontation with Margaret Sullivan in Thomas's bedroom changed everything between us. After months of legal warfare, conducted through lawyers and formal documents, we were finally facing each other as two women who had both loved the same man. "Why?" I asked her quietly, still holding Thomas's letter. "Why did you try so hard to deny what you knew was true?" Margaret sank into the chair by Thomas's desk, suddenly looking far older than her 50-something years. "Because accepting it meant accepting that I had failed him, that I had raised a son who felt he couldn't trust me with the most important decision of his life." Her confession hung in the air between us. Mr. Morrison, perhaps sensing that this was a moment that required privacy, quietly stepped out of the room. "He wanted to tell you," I said, gesturing to the letter. "He was planning to send this from New York. He hoped you would welcome me." "I know," Margaret whispered. "I've known since the day I found this letter. But admitting that would have meant admitting so many other things, that I cared more about social standing than my son's happiness, that I had become the kind of person he felt he needed to hide from." She stood and walked to Thomas's bookshelf. Running her fingers along the spines of books I remembered him telling me about. "When you first contacted us, claiming to be his wife, my first instinct was to protect our family's reputation. The idea that Thomas had married a factory girl seemed impossible, scandalous. So you decided I was lying." "I decided I wanted you to be lying," she corrected. "It was easier than facing the truth about what kind of mother I had become." Margaret turned back to me, and I was startled to see how much pain was in her eyes. "The forged letter, yes, it was forged. I hired someone to create it, thinking it would end this quickly and quietly. I told myself I was protecting Thomas's memory, but really, I was protecting myself from having to acknowledge my own failures. The admission should have made me angry, but instead I felt a strange kind of pity for her. This woman had lost her son and then compounded her grief by trying to erase the love that had made him happiest. "What changed your mind?" I asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Last week, I was going through some of Thomas's college letters, notes he'd written home during his final year at Harvard. He mentioned falling in love, but said he couldn't discuss it because the situation was delicate. At the time, I assumed he meant some unsuitable flirtation that would pass." She pulled out a small stack of letters tied with ribbon, but reading them again, knowing what I know now, I could see how much his feelings for you meant to him. He wrote about wanting to be worthy of someone's love, about learning to see the world through different eyes. He was becoming the man he wanted to be because of you. I thought about those months when Thomas and I were courting in secret, how he'd grown more confident and purposeful as our relationship deepened. His love for me had changed him, just as his love had changed me. There's something else, Margaret continued. The inheritance that Thomas was meant to receive. It's much larger than I let you believe. My father-in-law's will doesn't just provide for Thomas's wife. It includes provisions that would have given Thomas the independence to live exactly as he chose. She explained that the trust fund contained not just money but property, including a house in New York that Thomas had never known about. Father Sullivan believed in rewarding character over circumstances. If he'd lived to meet you, he would have approved of Thomas's choice. The weight of what I'd lost, not just Thomas, but the life we'd planned together, hit me anew. We could have had the house he'd dreamed of, the garden where I could grow flowers, the library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. We could have built something beautiful together. I can't give you back your husband, Margaret said softly, but I can give you what he wanted you to have. The inheritance, the recognition, the acknowledgement that you were truly his wife. What about your reputation? I asked. What will people say when they learn the truth? Margaret smiled sadly. They'll say that Thomas Sullivan was a young man who chose love over convention. They'll say he married a woman who made him happy. Some will disapprove, but others will think it romantic. And frankly, my dear, I no longer care what they say. She walked to Thomas's wardrobe and pulled out a small jewelry box. Inside was a beautiful diamond and sapphire ring. His grandmother's engagement ring, she explained. This should have been yours, she said, pressing the box into my hands. Thomas would have wanted you to have it. I stared at the ring, remembering how Thomas had apologized for not being able to give me a proper engagement ring when we married in secret. We'll do everything right when we get to New York, he'd promised. A proper announcement, a proper ring, a proper celebration of our marriage. I don't need it, I said, though the ring was beautiful. I just needed you to acknowledge that he loved me. He did love you, Margaret said firmly. More than I understood at the time. And you loved him. I can see it in your face when you talk about him. That love deserves to be honored, not hidden. The handwriting analysis we'd demanded confirmed what we now knew. The letter Margaret had produced was indeed a forgery. But by then, it no longer mattered. Margaret had already withdrawn her opposition to my inheritance claim and issued a public statement acknowledging our marriage. Mrs. Clara Sullivan was my son's beloved wife. The statement read, I deeply regret any confusion or pain my initial response may have caused during this difficult time. Thomas chose wisely when he chose Clara, and I welcome her to our family. The newspaper coverage was extensive but mostly positive. Titanic widow vindicated. Read one headline. Love conquers class. Sullivan family acknowledges secret marriage, proclaimed another. But the most meaningful acknowledgement came from Margaret herself. In a private letter she wrote to me after the legal proceedings were concluded, Clara, I hope someday you can forgive a grieving mother who let pride and prejudice cloud her judgment. Thomas would be proud of how you fought for your marriage and his memory. You have shown more grace and dignity than I deserve. Please know that you will always have a place in this family, if you choose to claim it. Standing in Thomas's room that December day, holding his letter, and surrounded by his belongings, I finally felt like his widow rather than an imposter fighting for recognition. The battle was over, and truth had prevailed. The full extent of what I had inherited became clear only when Mr. Morrison and I met with the bank officers who had managed Thomas's grandfather's trust. The meeting took place in a paneled conference room that smelled of leather and old money. The kind of place I never could have imagined entering as anything other than a servant. Mrs. Sullivan, the senior banker said, and I still felt a thrill of validation each time someone used my married name. Your late husband's inheritance is quite substantial. Beyond the monetary assets, there are several properties and business interests that now belong to you. The numbers were staggering. The trust contained over $50,000, more money than most people would see in several lifetimes. But it was the properties that took my breath away. There was the house in New York that Thomas had never known about, a brownstone in a fashionable neighborhood. There was also a small cottage on Cape Cod and a share in a profitable shipping company. Your husband's grandfather was very specific about these assets, the banker explained. He wanted to ensure that whoever Thomas chose to marry would have complete financial independence, regardless of family approval or disapproval. Henry Sullivan had been wiser than anyone realized. He'd understood that money was power, and he'd wanted Thomas's wife to have enough power to stand on her own, if necessary. If I'd known about this inheritance 8 months ago, would the Sullivan family have treated me differently? Perhaps not. Their objection hadn't really been about money, but about class and control. Mr. Morrison helped me navigate the complex paperwork required to claim the inheritance. There were stocks to transfer, property deeds to sign, and legal documents that would formally establish my financial independence. Through it all, I kept thinking about Thomas and how proud he would have been to see me sitting in that banker's office. No longer the powerless factory girl, but a woman of means. The monetary inheritance was life-changing, but it was the personal items that meant the most to me. Margaret had insisted I take everything from Thomas's room: his books, his clothes, his photographs, and most precious of all, his grandfather's pocket watch that had stopped at 11:40 p.m. on the night our world ended. Among his papers, I found a journal he'd kept during our courtship. Reading his private thoughts about our relationship brought both joy and heartbreak. Clara challenges everything I thought I knew about love and marriage. She sees past the Sullivan name to the man I want to become. When I'm with her, I feel like I can be honest about my dreams of social reform, my frustration with father's outdated business practices, my desire to make a real difference in the world. Another entry, written just before we sailed on the Titanic, revealed the depth of his commitment to our marriage. I've never been happier than I am now, married to Clara, and planning our life in New York. Tomorrow, we begin our real journey together. Whatever challenges await us, I know we can face them as long as we face them together. She is my heart's true companion, and I thank God every day for bringing her into my life. Reading those words, I understood that my fight for recognition hadn't just been about money or social position. It had been about honoring the profound love Thomas and I had shared. His family's initial denial had been an attempt to erase, not just me but the transformative power of our relationship. The inheritance also revealed something else that changed my understanding of the Sullivan family dynamics. Among the trust documents was a letter Henry Sullivan had written to his lawyer, explaining his motivations. I have watched too many wealthy families destroy their children's happiness by demanding marriages based on financial and social advantage, rather than genuine affection. My grandson Thomas has a good heart and sound judgment. When he chooses to marry, I want his choice to be respected and supported, regardless of his bride's background. Henry Sullivan had specifically anticipated a situation like mine. He'd seen how money and social pressure could corrupt family relationships, and he'd tried to build safeguards against that corruption. Unfortunately, his son Michael and daughter-in-law Margaret had needed to learn those lessons the hard way. The public acknowledgement of my marriage also brought unexpected benefits. Several other Titanic widows reached out to me, sharing their own struggles with bureaucracy and legal challenges. Some had been denied their husbands' benefits because they couldn't produce the right documentation. Others had been cheated by unscrupulous lawyers or family members. I began using my resources to help these women, hiring Mr. Morrison to represent those who couldn't afford legal assistance. It felt like a way to honor Thomas's memory while putting his grandfather's money to good use. Thomas had always cared about justice for working people. He would have approved of using his inheritance to help widows and orphans get what they deserved. The house in New York became my primary residence, and I found myself living the life Thomas and I had planned together, albeit alone. The brownstone had the library he'd dreamed of, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a fireplace where I spent long evenings reading. There was even a small garden where I grew the flowers he'd wanted me to have. But with financial security came a different kind of loneliness. I was now a wealthy widow with social standing, but I was still a young woman without her husband. The money couldn't replace Thomas's laugh, his gentle touch, or the conversations we'd shared about our future together. Margaret Sullivan surprised me by reaching out regularly, inviting me to family gatherings and treating me as the doctor I legally was. Our relationship remained complex. There was too much history for easy friendship, but we developed a mutual respect based on our shared love for Thomas. I see so much of him in the way you've handled this situation, she told me during one of our dinners together. He would be proud of your strength and grace. As 1912 drew to a close, I realized that my inheritance was about more than money or property. It was about the power to define my own life, to honor my marriage on my own terms, and to ensure that Thomas's love for me and mine for him would never be erased or forgotten. The true cost of my battle for recognition became clear only after I'd won it. The inheritance settlement revealed not just what I had gained, but what had been deliberately withheld from me during those terrible months of grief and legal fighting. The bank statements told a story of systematic denial that went far beyond simple family disapproval. Mr. Morrison laid out the documents across his desk with the careful precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Mrs. Sullivan, you should understand the full scope of what was kept from you. This wasn't just about refusing to acknowledge your marriage. It was about controlling access to resources that could have supported you through your grief." Numbers were staggering and heartbreaking. Thomas's trust had been generating income from the moment of his death: dividends, rental income, interest payments that should have been coming to me as his widow. Instead, that money had been accumulating in accounts I'd never known existed while I scraped together pennies for boarding house rent and took in sewing to buy food. Over the 8 months since Thomas's death, approximately $3,000 in income was withheld from you, Mr. Morrison explained. That's more than most working families see in 5 years. $3,000, while I'd been sleeping in a shared room with 2 other women, wondering if I could afford my next meal. Money that legally belonged to me had been sitting in Sullivan family accounts. While I'd borrowed clothes for Thomas's memorial service, his inheritance could have bought me an entire wardrobe, but the financial withholding was only part of the story. Margaret Sullivan's confession had revealed a more insidious pattern of emotional manipulation. The private investigators she'd hired hadn't just been looking for evidence to discredit me, they'd been actively spreading rumors about my character throughout Boston's working community. "I wanted to make sure you couldn't find steady employment," Margaret admitted during one of our difficult but necessary conversations. "I thought if you became desperate enough, you'd accept our settlement offer and disappear." The cruelty of that strategy was breathtaking. Not content with denying my marriage, she'd tried to destroy my ability to support myself independently. If I'd been a different kind of person, less determined, less certain of the truth, I might have been driven to take whatever money they offered just to survive. Mr. Morrison presented me with a corrected death certificate, one that properly listed me as Thomas's surviving spouse. Seeing my name in that official document, Clara Sullivan, wife, brought tears to my eyes. For months, I'd felt like a ghost haunting the edges of Thomas's life. Now, finally, I was officially recognized as the person who'd mattered most to him. The corrected certificate also entitled me to benefits I'd never known existed. As the widow of a Titanic victim, I was eligible for compensation from various relief funds. The White Star Line, facing numerous lawsuits, had established a settlement fund for families of the deceased. These payments, while modest compared to my inheritance, represented acknowledgement from the broader world that my loss was real and significant. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The workers at Sullivan Textile Mill, where Thomas and I had first met, organized a memorial service in his honor. They invited me to speak about the man they'd known as a fair and progressive manager. Standing before the assembled workers, many of whom I'd once worked alongside, I felt the full weight of what Thomas and I had represented. Our love story wasn't just about 2 individuals finding each other. It was about the possibility of bridging class divisions, of choosing humanity over hierarchy. Thomas Sullivan saw dignity in every person who worked in this mill, I told the crowd. He believed that a person's worth wasn't determined by their family name or bank account, but by their character and actions. He treated every worker with respect because he understood that we all have value. A woman from my old section raised her hand. "Is it true that he married you? That he chose one of us over all those society ladies?" "Yes," I said simply. "He chose love over convenience, and he never regretted it." The applause that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. These people understood what my marriage to Thomas had meant, not just for me, but for all of them. I represented the possibility that their daughters might someday be valued for who they were, rather than dismissed for where they came from. The speaking engagement led to others. Women's organizations, labor groups, and social reform societies invited me to share my story. I found myself becoming an advocate for working women's rights, using Thomas's inheritance to support causes he would have believed in. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Sullivan family's wealth, which they'd tried so hard to keep from me, was now being used to challenge the very class system they'd tried to protect. Thomas would have been delighted by the poetic justice of it all. But advocacy work, while meaningful, couldn't fill the emotional void left by Thomas's death. I was 24 years old, financially secure, and completely alone in the world. The inheritance had given me independence and purpose, but it couldn't give me back my husband or the future we'd planned together. The New York brownstone, beautiful as it was, felt empty without Thomas's presence. I'd furnished it with care, trying to create the home we'd dreamed of, but it was missing the most important element, the man who was supposed to share it with me, Margaret Sullivan. Perhaps, understanding my loneliness, began inviting me to family gatherings more frequently. "You're part of this family now," she insisted. "Thomas would want you to stay connected to his relatives." These visits were both comforting and painful. Thomas's sister Catherine was kind, and his father Michael had grudgingly accepted me as his daughter. But every family dinner, every holiday celebration, served as a reminder of the man who should have been there beside me. Justice, I learned, could be both sweet and hollow. By the spring of 1913, I had everything I'd fought for: recognition as Thomas's widow, access to his inheritance, acknowledgement from his family, and vindication in the public eye. Yet sitting in my beautiful New York brownstone, surrounded by luxury I'd never imagined, I felt the profound emptiness that no amount of money or recognition could fill. The legal victory had taken its toll on everyone involved. Margaret Sullivan, despite her public acknowledgement of our marriage, had aged visibly during our months of conflict. The stress of fighting a battle she knew was wrong had worn away some of her imperious confidence, leaving behind a woman struggling with guilt and grief. "I robbed us both of precious time," she confessed during one of our monthly dinners. "While we were fighting each other, we could have been grieving together, sharing memories of Thomas, helping each other heal." She was right. Those 8 months of legal warfare had stolen something irreplaceable: the opportunity to mourn Thomas properly, to celebrate his life rather than fighting over his death. I should have been able to grieve with his family immediately, to find comfort in shared memories and mutual support. The financial settlement, while substantial, couldn't compensate for that lost time. Margaret had been ordered by the court to pay additional damages for the months of withheld income, plus legal fees and interest. The total amount was staggering, enough to ensure I'd never want for anything material for the rest of my life. But I found myself thinking often about the cost beyond money. How many other women had been denied recognition and support because they lacked the resources to fight powerful families? How many legitimate claims had been dismissed simply because the claimants couldn't afford skilled lawyers or expert witnesses? I began working with Mr. Morrison to establish a legal aid fund for working women facing similar challenges. Using Thomas's inheritance felt like the right way to honor his memory. He'd always believed in using privilege and resources to help those with less power. The fund's first case involved a young seamstress whose husband had died in a factory accident. His employer was denying responsibility, claiming the man had been careless despite evidence of unsafe working conditions. Sound familiar? The parallels to my own situation, a working-class woman fighting powerful interests with limited resources, were unmistakable. "This is what Thomas would have wanted," I told Mr. Morrison as we reviewed the case. "He believed in justice for everyone, not just those who could afford it." The seamstress won her case, and word of our success spread through the working-class communities of Boston and New York. Soon we were handling dozens of cases: widows denied benefits, workers cheated of wages, women dismissed from jobs for organizing strikes. But even as this work gave meaning to my days, the evenings remained difficult. The brownstone's library, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable fireplace, should have been perfect for the quiet evenings Thomas and I had planned to spend reading together. Instead, I often found myself sitting alone, trying to imagine what our conversations might have been like. I began writing first in my journal, then in letters to newspapers about workers' rights and women's suffrage. Thomas had always encouraged my intellectual curiosity, and writing felt like a way to continue the discussions we'd begun during our brief time together. One of my articles, published in a Boston women's magazine, drew an unexpected response. A letter arrived from Dr. James Hartley, a professor at Harvard who had known Thomas during his college years. "I read your piece about workers' rights with great interest," Dr. Hartley wrote. "Your arguments reminded me strongly of conversations I had with Thomas during his final year at Harvard. He often spoke about the need for social reform and the obligation of educated men to use their privilege responsibly. I believe he would be proud of the work you're doing in his memory." The letter included an invitation to speak at a Harvard symposium on social reform. The idea of addressing the same institution where Thomas had been educated felt both thrilling and terrifying, but I accepted, knowing he would have encouraged me to share my perspective with people who needed to hear it. The speech was well received, leading to more speaking opportunities, and eventually to an offer to write a book about my experiences. The Factory Girls Fight, a Titanic widow's story of love and justice, was published in 1914 and became unexpectedly popular, particularly among women seeking to understand their legal rights. The book's success brought both satisfaction and unwanted attention. Reporters wanted to interview me, society hostesses invited me to their gatherings, and several prominent men expressed romantic interest. I was, after all, a young, attractive, and wealthy widow, exactly the kind of woman who might be considered a good match for ambitious gentlemen. But none of these suitors understood what Thomas and I had shared. They saw my money and social position without recognizing the love story that had created both. When they looked at me, they saw an opportunity rather than a person. Thomas had been different. He'd fallen in love with Clara the factory worker, not Clara the heiress. Margaret Sullivan, perhaps recognizing my emotional isolation, surprised me with an offer. "Why don't you spend some time at the Cape Cod cottage?" she suggested. It was Thomas's favorite place as a child. He always said he found peace there. The cottage proved to be exactly what I needed. Smaller and simpler than the New York brownstone, it felt more like a home than a monument to wealth. I could imagine Thomas there as a boy, collecting shells on the beach and reading adventure stories by the window. It was at the cottage that I finally found a measure of peace with my situation. I would always be Thomas's widow first, his wife second. Our love story would always be defined by its tragic ending rather than its joyful beginning, but that didn't make it less real or less meaningful. I established a routine there: morning walks on the beach, afternoons writing and reading, evenings by the fire with Thomas's favorite books. For the first time since his death, I felt connected to him in a way that brought comfort rather than pain. One evening, as I sat reading one of the poetry books he'd given me during our courtship, I realized that I had indeed received justice, not just legal or financial justice, but something deeper, the recognition that our love had been real, valuable, and worthy of honor. Now, as I sit here at 78, looking back across the span of my long life, I understand that the story I've told you was really about much more than a young woman fighting for recognition as a Titanic victim's widow. It was about the power of love to transform lives, the courage required to demand dignity, and the way truth ultimately prevails over even the most determined efforts to suppress it. The years following my legal victory were full and meaningful, in ways I never could have imagined when I was that grief-stricken 20-4-year-old. I did eventually find love again, not the desperate, all-consuming passion I'd shared with Thomas, but a mature, comfortable partnership with Dr. William Hartley, the Harvard professor who'd written to me about Thomas's social reform ideas. William understood that I would always carry Thomas's memory with me. He never asked me to remove my first wedding ring, or to pretend that Thomas hadn't been the love of my youth. Instead, he helped me build a life that honored both my past and my future. We married in 1918, had 2 children together, and built a partnership based on shared values and mutual respect. But I never stopped being Clara Sullivan, even as I became Clara Hartley. Thomas's name, his memory, and the lessons learned from our brief time together remained central to who I was. The legal aid fund we'd established grew into a permanent foundation that helped thousands of working women over the decades. The cottage on Cape Cod became a retreat where I wrote 3 more books about workers' rights and women's suffrage. Most importantly, I kept Thomas's grandfather's pocket watch, the one that stopped at 11:40 p.m. on the night the Titanic sank. I wore it on a chain around my neck for 66 years, and I'm wearing it now as I tell you this story. It reminds me daily that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, deepens, and becomes part of who we are forever. Margaret Sullivan and I developed an unlikely but genuine friendship over the years. She lived to be 8, spent countless afternoons talking about Thomas, sharing memories and stories that kept his spirit alive between us. She became the mother-in-law she should have been from the beginning, and I became the daughter she needed to learn how to love, without conditions. "You taught me something important," she told me shortly before her death in 1954. You taught me that a mother's job isn't to approve of her children's choices, but to support them in making those choices with integrity and courage. Thomas chose well when he chose you. The Sullivan family legacy changed because of our story. Thomas's sister Catherine married a minister who worked with immigrant communities, and their children grew up understanding that love and worth aren't determined by social status. The textile mill was eventually sold, and the proceeds used to establish scholarships for working-class students, the kind of program Thomas had always dreamed of creating. I saved every letter, every document, every piece of evidence from our legal battle. They're all here in this house now, carefully preserved in the library. Thomas and I had dreamed of sharing someday. Historians studying the Titanic disaster or the social conditions of the early 1900s will find our story and understand something important about love, class, and the courage required to demand recognition. The most precious item in that collection is still the simple gold wedding band Thomas placed on my finger during our secret ceremony at St. Patrick's Church. I've worn it for 67 years now. Through my legal battle, my second marriage, the birth of my children, and all the joys and sorrows of a long life, it's worn thin from decades of touching it whenever I needed to remember that I was loved completely and unconditionally by a good man. People sometimes ask me if I'm bitter about the months of fighting and denial that followed Thomas's death. The answer is no. That battle, painful as it was, forced me to become stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. It taught me to value myself the way Thomas had valued me, to demand respect rather than simply hoping for it. More importantly, the fight established legal precedents that helped other women in similar situations. The court decisions in my case made it harder for wealthy families to simply dismiss inconvenient marriages or deny inheritance rights to widows they deemed unsuitable. Other working-class women benefited from the courage I'd found to stand up to the Sullivan family's power and influence. As I prepare to join Thomas again, and yes, I do believe we'll be reunited, I want you to understand the most important lesson of our story. Love is not diminished by differences in social class, education, or family background. Real love sees past those surface distinctions to the heart of who a person truly is. Thomas loved me not, despite being a factory girl, but because I was a person of intelligence, integrity, and compassion who happened to work in a factory. I loved him not because he was wealthy, but because he was kind, principled, and committed to using his advantages to help others. The night before the Titanic struck that iceberg, Thomas and I talked about the children we hoped to have someday. We imagined raising them to see people as individuals rather than representatives of social classes, to choose their friends and partners based on character rather than circumstances. I did have those children, just not with Thomas, but I raised them with the values he and I had shared, and they've raised their children the same way. In that sense, Thomas's influence has rippled forward through generations, touching lives he never could have imagined. So when you think about my story, don't remember it as a tragedy of love lost too soon. Remember it as a triumph of love that refused to be denied, diminished, or forgotten. Remember it as proof that ordinary people can find extraordinary courage when they're fighting for something that matters. And remember that somewhere in Boston, there's a simple headstone bearing both our names, Clara and Thomas Sullivan, marking the resting place of two people who dared to believe that love was more important than social convention. After 66 years, I'm finally ready to lie beside my first husband again, wearing the wedding ring he placed on my finger during our secret ceremony and carrying the pocket watch that stopped the moment our earthly time together ended. If you've ever felt unseen or dismissed because of where you come from, if you've ever been told your love isn't good enough or your claims aren't valid, remember my story. Remember that truth has a power all its own, and courage can overcome even the most determined opposition.